Welcome back. Tonight's episode picks up just after the concert preparations, where Mary and Matthew shared that quietly heartbreaking exchange in the corridor. Their reunion was polished, almost regal, but full of feelings they didn't dare name aloud. Now, we step into that same evening as more guests arrive, doors open, and the hidden tensions in the house begin to surface. There are moments of kindness tonight, and moments that cut a little deeper. Wherever you're listening, I hope this brings you some rest. Chapter 5. The Reunion. The motor car rounded the final bend in the drive with the mechanical precision of modern engineering, yet nothing could have prepared its occupants for the full impact of Downton Abbey, rising before them in the gathering dusk. The great house seemed to emerge from the Yorkshire landscape, like something conjured from a fairy tale. Towers and turrets silhouetted against the darkening sky, windows blazing with golden light that spoke of warmth and permanence, and all the things that seemed so distant from the muddy trenches of France. Lavinia Swire pressed her gloved hand against the window, her breath catching at the sheer scale of what she was seeing. She had known, of course, that Matthew's inheritance was significant, but knowing and seeing proved to be entirely different experiences. This was not merely a house, but a small kingdom, a monument to centuries of accumulated wealth and power that dwarfed anything her imagination had conjured. "It's pretty grand," she murmured, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been apprehension. Matthew, seated beside her, felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied his return to Downton. The house seemed to regard him with the patient expectation of centuries, waiting for him to assume his proper role in its continuing drama. But after months in the trenches, where survival was measured in minutes rather than generations, the very concept of inherited responsibility felt as foreign as a language he had once spoken fluently, but could no longer quite remember. "You'd better get used to it," he said quietly, though his own voice betrayed the uncertainty that gnawed at him. "It'll be your home one day." The words hung between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to examine. Lavinia's response was characteristically practical, yet it carried depths of understanding that spoke well of her intelligence. I'm not sure home would ever be quite the word to describe it. Before Matthew could respond, the front doors opened with ceremonial precision, and Robert appeared at the top of the steps. Even from a distance, his pleasure was evident. The broad smile of a man greeting someone genuinely dear to him, the quick stride that spoke of eagerness barely contained by aristocratic dignity. Matthew climbed from the car with movements that still carried traces of military precision, his officer's bearing somewhat at odds with the civilian clothes he wore. The weeks in France had changed him in ways that were not immediately visible, but somehow fundamental. A wariness in his eyes, a tension in his shoulders, that spoke of a man who had learned to expect catastrophe at any moment. "My dear fellow, welcome back," Robert said, advancing with arms extended in greeting. "It's so very good to see you." The warmth in his voice was genuine, cutting through the awkwardness that might otherwise have surrounded this reunion. Here was a man who had watched too many young people disappear into the maw of war, who understood that every safe return was a small miracle worthy of celebration. "May I present Miss Lavinia Swire?" Matthew said, his voice carrying the particular formality that such occasions demanded. "How do you do, Lord Grantham?" Lavinia replied, her curtsy perfectly executed despite the intimidating circumstances. How do you do, Miss Swire?" From their seats in the front row of the makeshift auditorium, Violet and Cora observed this exchange with the sharp attention of generals studying troop movements. The Dowager Countess leaned slightly toward her daughter-in-law, her voice carrying the particular tone she reserved for observations that were meant to wound with surgical precision. "So that's Mary's replacement," she murmured, her lorgnette trained on Lavinia with the intensity of a naturalist examining an unusual specimen. "Well, I suppose looks aren't everything." The comment was delivered with the casual cruelty that Violet wielded like a perfectly balanced blade. In her calculation, Lavinia was pleasant enough, but entirely unremarkable, a perfectly adequate choice for someone who lacked the discrimination to appreciate true quality. Cora's response carried the gentle reproach of someone who had learned to navigate her mother-in-law's barbed observations without losing her own moral compass. "I think she seems rather sweet, and I'm afraid meeting us all together must be very intimidating." "I do hope so," Violet replied with satisfaction, her tone suggesting that intimidation was not an unfortunate side effect, but a desired outcome. Meanwhile, near the back of the hall, Mary had approached the small group gathered around Matthew and his fiancée. She moved with the particular grace that marked her as unmistakably aristocratic, the measured steps of someone who had never doubted her right to occupy any space she entered, the perfect posture that spoke of years of careful training in the art of public performance. "Hello, Miss Swire. I'm Mary Crawley," she said, her voice carrying exactly the right note of warmth to suggest genuine pleasure without implying actual intimacy. Lavinia's response revealed the nervousness that she had been working so hard to conceal. "Of course you are. I mean, I've been longing to meet you because I've heard so much about you from Matthew. That is," the words tumbled over each other in her eagerness to make a good impression, creating the sort of social stumble that Mary could have exploited mercilessly had she chosen to do so. As Lavinia fumbled with her words, a cruel, familiar impulse rose in Mary, the desire to deliver a single, perfectly aimed sentence that would put the girl firmly in her place. It would have been so easy. Instead, she consciously flattened the thought, smoothed her expression into a mask of benign interest, and produced a smile that felt as if it were constructed of spun glass. "Nice things, I hope," she said, the words emerging perfectly formed, giving no hint of the meticulous, exhausting internal calculation that had produced them. She was a Crawley. She would perform her duty even if it felt like swallowing ground glass. "What else would she hear from me?" Matthew interjected, his voice carrying a warmth that made both women look at him with sudden sharpness. As Robert and Isabel guided Lavinia away toward their seats, Mary and Matthew found themselves facing each other for the first time in months. The hall around them seemed to fade into insignificance, the chattering crowds and bustling preparations becoming mere background noise to this moment of profound connection and equally profound distance. The eyes of the entire gathering were upon them. Dozens of faces turned expectantly toward this reunion that everyone present understood to be freighted with significance. Here were the two people who should have been together, who had been destined for each other by every calculation of breeding and property and mutual suitability, yet who now stood separated by an engagement that made their relationship irrevocably complicated. "I can't say," Mary replied to Matthew's earlier observation, her voice carrying layers of meaning that only he would fully understand. "It's been such a long time. Who knows what you think of me now?" The words were perfectly chosen, seemingly innocent, yet containing just enough edge to suggest that she was not entirely without weapons in this encounter. She was reminding him, without saying so directly, that their last meeting had not concluded on the most cordial of terms. "I think I'm very glad to see you looking so well," Matthew responded, his voice carefully neutral, yet somehow managing to convey depths of feeling that made the conventional words resonate with unexpected emotion. Mary was silent for a moment, studying his face with the particular intensity of someone searching for signs of change, for evidence of what the war might have done to someone she had once known better than anyone. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of something that might have been surrender. "All right. You win. We are at peace again." She extended her hand with the gesture of someone offering a truce, and Matthew took it with the gravity of someone who understood that such offers were precious and not to be squandered. The handshake lasted perhaps a moment longer than strict propriety demanded, yet not long enough to cause genuine scandal, a perfectly calibrated display of reconciliation that gave the watching crowd exactly what they needed to see, without revealing anything that might be used against either of them later. This was the English way. The ability to conduct the most profound emotional negotiations in full public view, while maintaining the fiction that nothing particularly significant was occurring. Mary's performance was masterful, a demonstration of breeding and self-control that would have impressed even Violet. She was acknowledging the pain of their separation, while simultaneously demonstrating that she was entirely capable of moving beyond it, offering friendship while making it clear that she required nothing more than courtesy in return. For Matthew, watching this display of perfect emotional management, there was both relief and something that might have been regret. This was the Mary he had fallen in love with, intelligent, controlled, capable of navigating the most treacherous social waters without apparent effort. Yet there was something in her very perfection that reminded him of why their relationship had ultimately foundered. The walls that protected her from public embarrassment also kept her at a distance from genuine intimacy. As Robert called for the audience's attention and the evening's entertainment prepared to begin, Mary and Matthew took their seats with the careful awareness of people who had successfully negotiated a difficult passage, but who understood that the real challenges lay ahead. They had achieved peace, but it was the peace of exhausted combatants rather than the harmony of true reconciliation. In the depths of the house, far from the glittering assembly in the great hall, Carson moved through his domain. The pantry, with its gleaming silver and carefully ordered shelves, represented everything he valued most in the world. Tradition, hierarchy, the proper way of doing things that had served England well for centuries. But tonight, even this sanctuary could not provide its usual comfort. The knowledge that Matthew Crawley had returned to Downton, accompanied by a woman who was not Lady Mary, felt like a personal affront, a violation of the natural order that Carson had spent his entire adult life defending. Mistress Hughes appeared in the doorway, her expression carrying the particular mixture of exasperation and affection that marked all her dealings with the butler's more pronounced prejudices. "Have you found something nice?" she asked, noting the claret jugs he was preparing with unusual care. "Why, particularly," Carson replied, though his tone suggested he knew perfectly well what she was driving at. "As a welcome home for Mr. Matthew." Carson's grunt in response conveyed volumes about his current state of mind regarding the heir and his romantic choices. The sound contained disappointment, disapproval, and a profound sense that the world was failing to arrange itself according to his expectations. "What's the matter?" Mistress Hughes pressed, genuinely puzzled by his apparent hostility towards someone he had previously regarded with considerable favor. "I thought you'd come round to him." The observation struck at the heart of Carson's dilemma. He had come round to Matthew, had learned to appreciate his decency and intelligence, had even begun to see him as worthy of inheriting the Crawley legacy. But that acceptance had been predicated on the assumption that Matthew would eventually find his way back to Mary, that the natural order would ultimately reassert itself. The last time he was here, he hadn't broken Lady Mary's heart, Carson said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment. The words hung in the air between them, laden with all the fierce protectiveness that Carson felt toward the woman he had watched grow from a spirited child into the magnificent creature she had become. In his mind, Mary was not merely his employer's daughter, but something approaching his own child, the focus of devotions that he could never express directly, but that governed every aspect of his professional life. Mistress Hughes's response carried the particular exasperation of someone who had watched this drama unfold with clearer eyes than most. Lady Mary broke her own heart. That's if she has a heart to break. The observation was harsh, but not inaccurate. Mistress Hughes possessed the advantage of emotional distance that allowed her to see Mary's flaws as clearly as her virtues, to understand that the current situation was as much the result of Mary's pride and miscalculation as any failing on Matthew's part. "I don't think we're ever going to see eye to eye on this, Mistress Hughes," Carson replied, his voice carrying the finality of someone whose loyalties were too deep to be altered by logic. "She refused him when she thought he'd have nothing," Mistress Hughes continued relentlessly, "and when he was heir again, she wanted him back." "I thought caution was a virtue," Carson protested, grasping for some principle that might justify Mary's behavior. "Caution may be. Self-interest is not. Perhaps Miss Swire is a gentler person." The suggestion that Lavinia might actually represent an improvement over Mary was more than Carson could bear. His response came with the full weight of his prejudices and convictions. "If you ask me, this Miss Swire, who, it may interest you to know, is not to be found in Burke's peerage or Burke's landed gentry, has an eye to the main chance." The reference to the standard genealogical references revealed the depth of Carson's investigation into Lavinia's background and the conclusions he had drawn from his research. In his worldview, anyone who could not trace their lineage through the proper channels was automatically suspect, particularly when they appeared to be positioning themselves to benefit from association with their betters. "That's not snobbish, I suppose?" Mistress Hughes observed, with the particular sharpness she reserved for Carson's more pronounced displays of class prejudice. "I like to see things done properly, Mistress Hughes, and I won't apologize for that." With that declaration of principle, Carson gathered his claret jugs and departed, leaving his colleague to reflect on the curious ways in which personal loyalty could blind even the most perceptive individuals to obvious truths. In his determination to defend Mary's interests, Carson had positioned himself as the implacable enemy of a young woman whose only crime was falling in love with someone he considered to be already spoken for. The evening's entertainment continued above them, but in the servants' quarters, the real drama was just beginning to unfold. The complex interplay of loyalty and prejudice, tradition and change, that would determine how this household adapted to the new realities that the war had thrust upon them all. Chapter 6. A Public Shaming and a Private Vow. The strains of Johann Strauss's Tales from the Vienna Woods filled the great hall with a bitter irony that seemed lost on most of the assembled guests. Here they sat, raising funds for the war effort, while the orchestra played music from the very empire they were fighting against. But such contradictions had become commonplace in a world where the familiar had been turned upside down with bewildering speed. The makeshift auditorium hummed with the particular energy of a community event, the rustle of silk gowns, the low murmur of whispered conversations, the occasional cough from someone trying to remain inconspicuous. In the front rows, the family and their guests maintained the perfect posture that their breeding demanded, while behind them, the village worthies and estate workers filled the remaining chairs with the slightly awkward formality of people wearing their best clothes in unfamiliar surroundings. William stood along the side wall with the other servants, his livery immaculate despite the long day's preparations. He had been looking forward to this moment of respite, this brief interlude when the weight of his private shame might be temporarily forgotten in the pleasure of music and community spirit. But as the orchestra moved through their repertoire, he found his attention wandering to the faces around him. Young men in civilian clothes who seemed to carry themselves with a particular self-consciousness that spoke of questions they preferred not to answer. The interruption, when it came, sliced through the musical interlude like a blade through silk. 2 young women appeared at the side entrance, their purposeful stride and militant bearing immediately distinguishing them from the assembled guests. They moved through the hall with the particular righteousness of people on a moral crusade, their eyes scanning the crowd with predatory intensity. In their hands, they carried small white objects that seemed innocuous until one understood their significance. White feathers, symbols of cowardice that had become the weapons of choice for those who believed that shame could succeed where patriotism had apparently failed. The campaign had spread across England with the efficiency of a disease, turning public spaces into potential battlegrounds where young men could find themselves branded as cowards by strangers who knew nothing of their circumstances. William watched their approach with growing horror, understanding instinctively that he was about to become the target of something that would strip away his dignity in front of everyone he knew. The first woman reached him with the mechanical precision of someone performing a duty that had become routine. "Here," she said, thrusting a white feather toward him with the casual brutality of someone who had convinced herself that public humiliation was a form of patriotic service. William stared at the feather as if it were a poisonous snake, his mind struggling to process what was happening. "What is it?" "A white feather, of course," the woman replied, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone delivering what she considered to be well-deserved punishment. "Coward," added her companion, the single word dropping into the silence like a stone into still water. The accusation seemed to echo through the hall, despite the continuing music, transforming what should have been a moment of community celebration into something approaching a public execution. William took the feather without thinking, his fingers closing around it automatically, while his mind reeled from the enormity of what had just occurred. Every person in his immediate vicinity had witnessed this exchange. Every face he would see tomorrow would carry the knowledge that he had been publicly branded as a man who lacked the courage to serve his country. The shame was a physical thing, burning in his chest like acid, making it difficult to breathe. Robert had risen from his seat with the instinctive reaction of someone who recognized an intolerable breach of proper conduct. His face was flushed with anger as he strode toward the women, his aristocratic bearing investing his intervention with an authority that brooked no argument. "Stop this at once," he commanded, his voice carrying across the hall with the particular force that came from generations of unquestioned authority. "This is neither the time nor the place." But the women were undeterred by his rank or his obvious displeasure. They had convinced themselves that they were engaged in essential war work, that their public shaming of young men was somehow contributing to the national effort. "These people should be aware that there are cowards among them," the second woman replied, with the confidence of someone who believed that righteousness trumped mere social convention. Robert's response came with the full weight of his moral authority and his genuine understanding of the complexities that these women chose to ignore. "Will you please leave? You are the cowards here, not they. Leader, will you continue?" The orchestra resumed their playing with visible relief, but the damage had been done. The atmosphere in the hall had been poisoned by this display of righteous cruelty, this reminder that even in their own homes, young men could not escape the pressure to justify their presence among the living. As the women departed, they passed Branson near the doorway, and with automatic efficiency handed him a white feather as well. But his reaction proved entirely different from William's anguish. Instead of shame, his face showed nothing but amusement. "I'm in a uniform," he pointed out, with the particular satisfaction of someone scoring a point in a debate. "Wrong kind," the woman replied dismissively. Branson's laughter in response was genuine and utterly untroubled. The entire exchange seemed to delight rather than distress him, and he made no attempt to hide his amusement at their ignorance. Here was a man who refused to grant these women the power to humiliate him, who understood that shame required a willing participant. The difference between his reaction and William's was instructive. Branson possessed the advantage of political conviction. He did not support the British government or the war they were prosecuting, and therefore felt no obligation to justify his choices to representatives of a cause he considered fundamentally unjust. His identity was not dependent on their approval, and their disapproval therefore carried no sting. William, by contrast, desperately wanted to serve, but was prevented by circumstances beyond his control. The feather represented everything he feared about himself, every private doubt about his courage and commitment, magnified and displayed for public consumption. The women had found his weakness and exploited it with surgical precision. As the evening continued, the incident cast a shadow over what should have been a celebration. But perhaps that was fitting in a time when even the simplest pleasures carried the weight of moral complexity, when every gathering was haunted by the absence of those who could not attend. The kitchen courtyard of Downton Abbey had always been a place where the formal hierarchy of the house relaxed into something approaching ordinary human relationships, away from the public rooms where every gesture was observed and judged. The servants could allow themselves moments of genuine emotion that would have been impossible under the scrutiny of their employers. Tonight, the familiar space seemed transformed by anticipation and nervous energy. Anna paced between the stone walls with barely contained excitement, her usual composure cracked by the knowledge that this conversation would determine the shape of her entire future. The autumn air carried the bite of approaching winter, but she felt flushed with warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. When Bates appeared in the doorway, his solid presence seemed to anchor the swirling possibilities of the evening into something concrete and real. They had been circling around this moment for months, exchanging glances across crowded rooms and stealing brief conversations in corridors, but always with the understanding that their hopes were constrained by circumstances beyond their control. "She just turned up at my mother's house," Bates said without preamble, getting straight to the heart of the matter that had dominated his thoughts since returning from London. "Not long before she died." Anna studied his face in the dim light, reading there a mixture of hope and disbelief that suggested he still could not quite credit his change in fortune. "So, what does it mean?" "I think it means, at long last, I'm able to get a divorce." The words hung in the air between them, pregnant with possibilities that neither had dared to voice aloud. For so long their relationship had existed in a kind of suspended animation, acknowledged but not acted upon, cherished but not consummated. Now, suddenly, the future was opening before them like a door they had long believed to be permanently locked. Anna stared at him in silence, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he was suggesting. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of wonder that made the conventional words sound like poetry. "Mr. Bates, is this a proposal?" "If that's what you want to call it," he replied with the particular gruffness that marked his most emotional moments. "And you might start calling me John." The suggestion that she abandon the formal address they had always maintained was perhaps more intimate than any declaration of love could have been. It represented a fundamental shift in their relationship, an acknowledgement that they were moving beyond the careful boundaries that had governed their interactions. "Why are you sure she'll do it now when she's refused for so long?" Anna asked, her practical nature asserting itself even in this moment of emotional intensity. "Mother left me some money, much more than I thought," Bates explained, his voice carrying the amazement of someone who had never expected to possess significant financial resources. "Vera's a greedy woman. She won't refuse what I can offer her." The cold calculation in his assessment of his wife's character was jarring, but Anna understood that it represented hope rather than cynicism. If Vera could be bought, then their freedom could be purchased, and the future could finally begin. "Will we have to leave Downton?" Anna asked, voicing the concern that had been lurking beneath her excitement. "Not until we want to," Bates assured her. "I've spoken to his lordship, and he'll find a cottage for us, near the house." The fact that he had already approached Robert about their future plans was both thrilling and slightly scandalous. "You told him you want to marry me?" "I did. Before you spoke to me?" The question carried a note of mock indignation that barely concealed her delight. "You don't mind, do you?" Anna's response came with the full force of emotion that she had been suppressing for months. "Of course I mind. In fact, I'd give you a smack if I didn't want to kiss you so much I could burst." The declaration was the closest either of them had come to expressing the depth of their feelings for each other. In a world where their relationship existed at the mercy of their employer's goodwill and the rigid constraints of their social positions, such open emotional expression felt revolutionary. And so, at last, they kissed. It was their first, and it carried the weight of all the months of careful restraint and suppressed longing that had brought them to this moment. In the quiet courtyard, Surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of the great house, they allowed themselves to believe that happiness was possible, even for people like them. The kiss was tender rather than passionate, speaking of deep affection and mutual respect rather than mere physical attraction. It was the kiss of two people who had found in each other not just romantic fulfillment, but genuine partnership, the promise of a life built on shared values and complementary strengths. When they finally separated, both were smiling with the particular radiance of people who had just discovered that their most cherished hopes were not merely fantasies, but achievable realities. The future, which had seemed so uncertain just hours before, now stretched before them filled with concrete plans and tangible possibilities. As they stood together in the gathering darkness, Anna and Bates represented something precious in a world increasingly characterized by loss and separation. They were proof that love could survive even the most challenging circumstances, that ordinary people could create extraordinary happiness through nothing more than patience and devotion. Their joy stood in stark contrast to the shame and humiliation that had marked the evening's public events. While William carried the burden of undeserved disgrace, and the evening's entertainment proceeded under the shadow of moral judgment. Here in the private spaces of the house, two people had found a way to transcend the limitations that circumstances had imposed upon them. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, human connection could provide light, that individual happiness remained possible even when the larger world seemed bent on destruction. Their love was not an escape from the war's impact, but a victory over it, proof that the human capacity for joy could not be entirely extinguished by external forces, no matter how overwhelming they might seem. Later that night, long after the great house had fallen silent, Daisy crept back down to the servants' hall, ostensibly in search of the magazine Ethel had been reading. She pushed open the door and fumbled for the light switch. The familiar space was dark and quiet, the residual heat from the hearth barely warding off the night's chill. When the electric bulbs flickered to life, they illuminated a solitary, desolate figure. William was sitting at the long table, staring into the middle distance, the white feather of cowardice still clutched in his hand. He looked as though he had not moved in hours. Daisy found the magazine, but she didn't leave. The sight of him, so utterly broken, stirred something in her that was deeper than their usual playful banter. Her usual timidity warred with a newfound flicker of courage. She decided to chatter, to fill the terrible silence with the sound of a normal life. "I hope you've noticed I'm not scared of electricity anymore," she began, her voice a little too bright. "Well, not much. I couldn't touch a switch when it were only upstairs, but I've got used to it now." He did not speak. The silence seemed to press down on them. She took a breath and went to sit by him, her sympathy overcoming her fear. "I hate to see you like this," she said softly. "Even though I'm a dirty coward." William's voice was hollow, stripped of all its usual warmth. "You are not," Daisy insisted fiercely. "Not to me." "But why don't I enlist?" "I could," he murmured, his thoughts turning inward, his gaze lost in the grain of the wooden table. "I know I promised my dad, but he's not my owner. He's not the law. Am I frightened? Is that it? Honestly?" "Don't be so hard on yourself," Daisy pleaded, her heart aching for him. "No one wants to go to war. Oh, I wish you'd cheer up, please. I'd do anything to cheer you up. Like what? He asked, a flicker of life returning to his eyes as he finally looked at her. Daisy met his gaze. She saw the question there, the hope he'd carried for so long, now drowned in a sea of shame. She thought of all the times he'd looked at her with unspoken affection, of all the small kindnesses he'd shown her, and in a moment, born of compassion and a surprising new maturity, she made a decision. Like this. She leaned across the small space between them and kissed him gently on the mouth. The kiss was hesitant and chaste, more an offering of comfort than of passion, but it succeeded in pulling him out of his black reverie. He blinked, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time, but there was a profound sorrow in his eyes. You just feel sorry for me, he said, and it was a statement, not a question. The hope in his face died, replaced by a quiet resignation. Daisy sat back, her own cheeks flushing. William, I've kissed you, she replied, her voice steady and clear. You've wanted me to long enough. Well, now I have. Enjoy it. And with that, she stood and walked out of the hall, leaving him alone once more, but this time with something other than a white feather to hold on to in the darkness. Chapter 7. Departures and Deceptions. The dining room at Downton Abbey had witnessed countless formal meals over the decades, but tonight's dinner carried an electric undercurrent that transformed the familiar ritual into something approaching theatrical performance. The family silver gleamed under the soft glow of candlelight, and the servants moved with their customary precision. Yet everyone present seemed acutely aware that they were participating in a carefully choreographed dance around unspoken tensions. Matthew sat to Robert's right, with Lavinia positioned according to the protocols that governed such occasions. But despite the geographical arrangement that placed him at a respectable distance from Mary, he found his attention drawn to her with magnetic inevitability. She moved through the courses with her characteristic grace, contributing to the conversation with precisely the right degree of engagement. Yet there was something in her manner that suggested she was performing rather than simply being. Where did you and Matthew meet? Robert asked Lavinia, his voice carrying the genial interest of a host determined to put his guests at ease. Oh, in London, Lavinia replied, her nervousness evident in the slight breathlessness of her response. My father works in London, so I've always lived there, but I love the country too. Violet's interjection carried the particular acid that marked her most pointed observations. Of course you do. The words seemed innocent enough, but their delivery suggested depths of skepticism that made Lavinia shift uncomfortably in her chair. There was an art to such social cruelty, the ability to communicate disapproval through tone and timing, while maintaining the facade of polite conversation. Daddy's a solicitor, like Matthew, Lavinia continued, perhaps hoping that this connection might establish her credentials with the family. My, Violet replied with mock wonderment. You're very well placed if you're ever in trouble with the law. Across the table, Robert was deep in conversation with Matthew about his military appointment, their voices carrying the particular enthusiasm of men discussing matters that seemed to offer escape from domestic complications. But Matthew found his attention wandering to Mary, who sat with perfect posture, yet somehow managed to convey the impression of someone listening to a conversation taking place in another room. He won't go with them, will he? Matthew asked quietly, turning toward Mary with the unconscious intimacy of someone seeking reassurance from a trusted source. When they're called to the front, Mary's response was measured, but her eyes met his with an understanding that transcended the careful politeness they had maintained throughout the evening. I hope not, but he seems to think so. What's it been like? The simple question opened a chasm between them, the vast gulf that separated those who had seen war from those who had only read about it in newspapers. Matthew's face underwent a subtle transformation, the social mask slipping momentarily to reveal something raw and unprocessed. Do you know, the thing is, I just can't talk about it. But even as he spoke, his mind was clearly elsewhere, transported back to trenches and bombardments, and sights that had no place in a civilized dining room. Mary watched this internal journey with an expression of profound understanding, recognizing the particular distance that came over men when they tried to reconcile their wartime experiences with peacetime conversations. Have you missed us? She asked softly, her voice barely audible above the general conversation. What do you think? The exchange was conducted in the language of subtext and implication, two people having an entirely different conversation from the one their words suggested. Every glance carried weight, every pause spoke volumes, yet they managed to maintain the fiction that they were simply making polite dinner conversation. As the evening progressed, Carson appeared at the sideboard with the particular tension that marked his interactions with unfamiliar guests. When he reached Lavinia's place to serve the dessert, his smile was professionally warm, yet somehow calculating. How delicious. I love these, Lavinia said, admiring the elaborately prepared creation before helping herself to one portion. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes meeting Carson's with a mixture of uncertainty and temptation. Do I dare? Let her show herself, he thought with grim satisfaction. Let the family see exactly what sort of person chooses to take more than her fair share. Carson's encouraging nod seemed benevolent enough. Lavinia took a second helping with the guilty pleasure of someone indulging in a minor transgression, but her innocent enjoyment was interrupted by Violet's raised eyebrows and the subtle shift in atmosphere that suggested she had somehow transgressed against unspoken rules of proper conduct. The remainder of the dinner proceeded with careful politeness, but the undercurrents of tension and judgment continued to swirl beneath the surface of civilized conversation. In the servants' hall below, the evening had taken on an entirely different character. The staff gathered around the long table with the particular camaraderie that marked their brief periods of leisure, sharing gossip and observations about the evening's events with the freedom that came from being among their own kind. Ethel sat reading a magazine, her face illuminated by the electric bulb that still seemed miraculous to some of the older servants. The pages before her were filled with photographs and stories from a world that seemed impossibly glamorous, yet tantalizingly accessible. What are you reading? Daisy asked, settling beside her with the curiosity of someone hungry for any glimpse of life beyond their immediate circumstances. Photoplay. About Mabel Normand, Ethel replied, her voice carrying the particular reverence reserved for objects of aspiration. She was nothing when she started, you know. Her father was a carpenter and they'd no money. None at all. And now she's a shining film star. It just shows it can happen. The magazine represented more than entertainment. It was a catalogue of possibilities, proof that ordinary people could transform themselves into something extraordinary through talent and determination. In a world where social mobility had traditionally moved at glacial pace, such stories offered hope that the old restrictions might finally be loosening. O'Brien's entrance into the hall carried an air of theatrical purpose that immediately caught everyone's attention. She moved with the particular authority of someone bearing important information, her expression serious enough to suggest that whatever she had to communicate was not trivial. "Ethel, I've a message for you. From her ladyship," she announced, her voice carrying just the right note of official importance. The statement sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled servants. Direct communication from Lady Grantham to a junior housemaid was unusual enough to warrant attention, and Ethel's expression shifted from casual interest to nervous anticipation. "You're to go up and see her now," O'Brien continued, with the brisk efficiency of someone conveying urgent instructions. "What? Where?" Ethel asked, her voice rising slightly with anxiety. "In the drawing room, of course. They're all in the drawing room." The casual certainty of O'Brien's response lent credibility to her instructions, and Ethel found herself caught between excitement and terror at the prospect of such an unprecedented summons. Around the table, the other servants watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to sympathy. "But what have I done wrong?" Ethel asked, grasping for some explanation that might make sense of this development. "Nothing. Quite the reverse," O'Brien assured her with the particular smoothness of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. "She's very pleased with the way you've begun, and she wants to thank you." The explanation was plausible enough to overcome Ethel's remaining doubts. After all, she had been working hard to prove herself worthy of her position, and recognition from Lady Grantham herself would represent the ultimate validation of her efforts. "Now?" Ethel asked, still struggling to process the magnitude of what was being asked of her. "Yes, now. She's asked for you. How much longer are you going to keep her waiting?" The suggestion that further delay might constitute an insult to Lady Grantham's patience was enough to galvanize Ethel into action. She stood quickly, smoothing her uniform and checking her appearance with the desperate efficiency of someone who understood that this moment might determine her entire future at Downton. As she hurried from the room, the remaining servants sat in stunned silence for a moment before exploding into laughter. The cruelty of O'Brien's deception was immediately apparent to everyone except its victim, and their amusement carried the particular edge that came from witnessing someone else's misfortune while being powerless to prevent it. In the drawing room above, the family had settled into their post-dinner arrangements with the comfortable familiarity of people following well-established routines. Violet occupied her customary position on the sofa, observing the evening's dynamics with the sharp attention of a general reviewing troop movements. Cora sat nearby, while Mary and Edith flanked Lavinia in what appeared to be a friendly conversation, but felt more like a subtle interrogation. "I don't know much about life in the country," Lavinia was saying, her voice carrying the earnest quality of someone determined to make a good impression. "But I do understand how the law works, so I believe I can be helpful to Matthew there." The comment was innocent enough, yet it seemed to highlight the vast gulf between her background and theirs. While they had been raised to understand the intricate protocols of country society, she offered practical skills that might prove more valuable in a changing world. The conversation was interrupted by the unprecedented sight of Ethel appearing in the doorway, her face flushed with nervous excitement and her uniform pristine despite her obvious anxiety. Carson, assuming she was bringing him a message, stepped forward to receive her communication. But instead, she addressed Cora directly. "Beg pardon, milady, for keeping you waiting," Ethel said, her voice breathless with a mixture of pride and terror. The words fell into the elegant room like a stone through glass, creating ripples of confusion that spread outward from their point of impact. Cora's face registered complete bewilderment as she tried to process what was happening. "What?" she managed to say, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone who believed she must have misheard something fundamental. "I'm ever so grateful for your appreciation, and I want you to know that it's a privilege to work here," Ethel continued, delivering what she clearly believed to be an appropriate response to a summons from her employer. The entire room had fallen silent, the elegant post-dinner conversation abandoned in favor of watching this bizarre theatrical performance unfold. Cora turned to Carson with an expression that begged for clarification of what appeared to be a collective hallucination. "Ethel, what are you doing in here?" Carson asked, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone attempting to restore order to a situation that had veered entirely off course. "Her ladyship sent for me," Ethel replied with the confidence of someone stating an obvious fact. "And who gave you this message?" "Miss O'Brien. She said I wasn't to keep her ladyship waiting." The revelation struck the room like a thunderbolt, immediately illuminating the true nature of what had just transpired. Carson's expression shifted from confusion to carefully controlled anger as he processed the implications of what had occurred. "You may go back downstairs now, thank you, Ethel," he said, with the gentle firmness of someone attempting to minimize the damage to an innocent victim. As Ethel retreated with obvious confusion, bobbing a curtsy that only emphasized the awkwardness of the entire situation, a heavy silence settled over the room. The cruelty of the deception was immediately apparent to everyone present, and Violet's response carried the particular dryness that marked her most pointed observations. "Well, do we think she's mad, ill, or working for the Russians?" Cora's response carried the weary authority of someone who had dealt with O'Brien's manipulations for years. "I'm afraid O'Brien has been playing a trick. Don't punish the girl." "The girl is not the one I'd like to punish, your ladyship," Carson replied with feeling, his voice carrying the particular venom he reserved for those who abused their positions to cause unnecessary suffering. As the evening drew to its close and the guests prepared for departure, Matthew found himself walking toward the waiting car with Mary beside him. The short distance between the house and the vehicle seemed to stretch into infinity, each step carrying the weight of unspoken emotions and unexpressed regrets. "She has plenty of time to learn," Matthew said, though his words seemed to be directed more at himself than at Mary. "Cousin Robert will be in charge here for many years. Lavinia will be a lawyer's wife far longer than she'll be a countess. That's if I get through the war in one piece." The casual reference to his own mortality fell between them like a shadow, a reminder of the fundamental uncertainty that governed all their lives. Mary's response was immediate and fierce, carrying the particular intensity of someone who refused to acknowledge unacceptable possibilities. "Of course you will. Don't even think like that. How long are you staying in the village?" "Just tomorrow. I take the 6 o'clock train on Thursday. And then you'll be in France." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with all the things they could not say directly. This might be their last conversation, their final opportunity to express feelings that had been carefully suppressed throughout the evening's formal proceedings. "Wherever I'm going, I'm so pleased that we're friends again," Matthew said, his voice carrying the particular warmth that had always marked their most intimate moments. "So we've both been lucky," Mary replied, though her eyes suggested that luck was not exactly the word she would have chosen to describe their current circumstances. As Branson held the car door and the evening's performance finally drew to its close, both Mary and Matthew understood that they had successfully navigated one of the most challenging social situations either had ever encountered. They had maintained the fiction of friendship while acknowledging the deeper currents that continued to flow between them, had demonstrated their breeding while protecting their hearts from further damage. But in that brief moment before Matthew climbed into the car and disappeared back into the war that had already claimed so much, both of them allowed themselves to remember what they had lost and to acknowledge, if only to themselves, what they might yet hope to find again.